Hello and welcome to our presentation, British Sign Language. In this group is Hanin Sedky, me, Basma, and Mohammed. So we're gonna start talking about speakers. According to official figures, the British Deaf Association estimates that 151 citizens in the UK use British Sign Language, with 87% of them being deaf and the rest using it as a second language. BSL is used by 125,000 deaf adults and 20,000 children in the United Kingdom. In England and Wales, 50,000 people used BSL as their primary language in 2011. As for where does the BSL is spoken, in which region in the world there are BSL speakers, most of the BSL speakers are from the UK, and it's their first or preferred language of some deaf people in the UK. Okay, start.
Okay. Language status information. It is widely assumed that the first language of deaf people born in Britain will be English. This is a mistaken assumption and is profoundly damaging to British deaf people both personally and politically. The language of the British deaf community is the British Sign Language, or BSL. English is used as a second language primarily for communication with hearing people. Those deaf people whose first language is not BSL generally only have a partial hearing loss or have become deaf later in life. They tend to be outside the deaf community on both cultural and linguistic grounds. BSL is the most easily learned and most naturally used language of the deaf people in the UK. Those deaf children whose parents are deaf learn sign language at least as fast as hearing children learn a spoken language from their hearing parents. 90% of deaf people have hearing parents, and so BSL is rarely the first language that deaf people are exposed to. Neither it is the first nor often the second language of their parents. However, it is argued that it is nevertheless deaf people's first rather than second language because of its role in the deaf community, as well as its importance as a means of communication for the deaf individual once acquired. Stigma around BSL. The deaf community are underprivileged both politically and personally. Their access to their first language is limited, and for the longest time, their community was not recognized for the linguistic minority which it is. BSL was recognized by the UK government as an official minority language only in 2003. Before then, access to BSL was limited, and the use of it was opposed to with and by the deaf. Accessibility. This means that basically hearing people prefer to let deaf people do all the work. So, for example, sign language gloves were created. They ended up being inaccurate and too expensive. A much easier, cheaper, and faster alternative would have been actually learning the sign language. Yet, hearing people keep trying to find ways around it. Ways we can help to make our content on social media accessible is that we can add captions on our content. For example, in Instagram and TikTok, there are now automatically generated captions for videos we upload. These are designed specifically for deaf people. Another stigma is that being deaf is the problem. However, this is not true. Being deaf is not the problem. The real problems are the barriers they face every day due to inaccessibility. Who studies BSL as a foreign language? Post-linguistically deaf people, those are people who were not born deaf and so had access to a spoken language before going deaf later on in life. Hard hearing people, these are people that have some hearing loss but are not completely deaf. Parents to deaf children, specifically hearing parents to deaf children. However, in some cases, the parents have a hard time learning the language and so they will resort to social workers. Here is a clip from a movie, A Silent Child, where a young deaf girl's hearing parents get help from a social worker who teaches their daughter BSL as she prepares to go to school for the first time. Other people, wait, can you go back? Sorry. Other people that learn or study BSL as a foreign language are interpreters and linguists.
Historical information. Now, before formal sign language came, uh, sign language was seen as like an act of communicating with our hands and always proceeded in formal language. So you could see sign language being used in pantomimes, mostly artistic like careers where they use sign language as a way of expressing one another. And the historical history of sign language in Western cultures began in the 17th century as a visual language or a mode of communication, as said before. And sign language is a system of traditional gestures, mimic hand signals, and finger spelling, as well as the use of hand positions to represent the letters of the alphabet, make up sign language. Not only individual sentence, but also full concepts or phrases may be represented by signs. So before speech, hand, and facial gestures were the form of interaction, British Sign Language used by the deaf community of Britain was considered a simple array of gestures and pantomime. And the first record of BSL being used was known in the marriage certificate of Thomas Tilsey and Ursula Russell. And they're unclear about the exact year of when it happened. But the account of this marriage, it said that Thomas used his expression of his mind instead of words to say his vows. And so they say it was around 1570, but there is no, yeah, they range from 75 to 86. So the history of sign language or British Sign Language it goes back to 1760, where Thomas Braywood, he's a teacher who taught sign language in Edinburgh, and he founded Braidwood's Academy for the Deaf and Dumb. Now back then, because of the stigma, they used to associate being deaf by being dumb because they lacked a sense, a normal sense, so they made them look as if they were dumb because they can't make any normal, they cannot voice any normal words as a normal human being. But not saying that they're not normal, but that's what they used to think back then, yeah. And so this credited as the Britain's first deaf school, and it educated deaf children through speech, lip reading, and signs. And it came at the time where they banned sign language in schools, and so deaf children had to rely on lip reading in order to understand the people around them and to communicate with one another. And so the first codification of what would become British Sign Language was the combined system. So they would combine speech, lip reading, and signs. And because of Thomas Braywood, he spread the teachings of sign language and he trained Joseph Watson, who became a deaf instructor. And in 1792, he resigned to become the headmaster of Britain's first public school for the deaf, the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb in Bermondsey. Now, as I said before, the history of British Sign Language, it was kind of oppressive from the hearing people. And so as late as the 1980s, the sign language used by the deaf communities in Britain was considered a simple collection of gestures and facial expression. So in the 1800s, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who actually founded the American Sign Language and developed it, he traveled to Europe to learn more about the deaf education and from at Braywood, and they returned him down and refused to show him their practice, seeing that he's American. And so when he traveled to Paris to study the other practices of from the French Royal Institution for the Deaf, he mixed Old French Sign Language with another founder of sign language, but for the French, Abbé de la Pie. And as a consequence to that, American Sign Language today has a 60% similarity to modern French Sign Language and is almost unintelligible to users of British Sign Language. So over the years, BSL has grown in popularity over the last few years, and it's been started to use in TV, both in programs, and featuring sign languages interpreters that provide access to sign language users in the programs directly aimed at deaf people. So you would find them at the bottom right corner of the screen, signing as the show goes or the program goes. And the progression of BSL, it's quite different to what it could be, and it's confusing to older generation of BSL users since the language has developed so much. And so similarly to the developments within the English language, different age groups have developed different signs for the same things. BSL is an evolving language, but one thing that no one knows is that signers class, age, gender, ethnicity, and religion can all affect in which way they sign, which led to many different variation within one variety of sign language alone. So these are the different, so if we were to look at, there were no dialects known in BSL, and they say that there were dialects previously, but they kind of died down with the older generation because of how the language developed. And so it's become more of every region in the UK has a different interpretation of BSL. Now, in the writing system, every sign language uses in-sign writing words in sign language. And as said before, it's a mixture of classic symbols, hand shapes, orientation, body location, facial gestures, contacts, and movements. And the writing system itself relies on expression of the person rather than learning the alphabet and so. So they don't have a proposed writing system. And there's also an international system that can be used for more than one sign called the Hamburg notation system, but it was never intended to be used as an everyday system. It's more like the International Phonetic Alphabet for oral languages. So this is the writing system that's used in British Sign Language. And if you can see, C is the only letter that's used by one hand, and all the other letters are used by two hands. So this is the family tree. So the British Sign Language, it goes throughout Northern Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, mostly, and then it branches out across the globe. But the one sign language where you can actually see it present up until now is Maritime Sign Language and Swedish Sign Language. Auslan and New Zealand are a mixture of American Sign Language as well, so it's not primarily British Sign Language, and the rest are branches of sign languages as well. So there are six dialects of sign language, but in general, what BSL uses is Bansal, which is British, Australia, and New Zealand. So they're called Bansal. Linguistic information. So for phonology, the British Sign Language is described as a spatial language since it moves signs in space. So BSL phonology is defined by elements such as hand shape, orientation, and as said before. And so they use their hand shape, movement, location, orientation. So if you saw in the video, she uses her fingers towards her face, her mouth to express herself. And facial expression, they're non-manual features, component of phonology. So eyebrow height, eye gaze, mouthing, head movement, and torso rotation actually make a difference as well in sign language. And the meanings of the word differ if one of these components is changed. So if she changes the way she gazes, the head movement, the torso rotation, the way she moves her hand, the movement, the location of her fingers, they all mean different words. For syntax, BSL has its own grammar with a particular syntax, and one important component of BSL is its use of proforms. And a proform is any form that stands in the place of or does the job of some other form. And sentences are composed of two parts in order, the subject and the predicate. BSL uses a object subject verb, and the BSL sign order is usually time frame topic comment, but it could be different depending on the time frame, the topic, the comment. So these are two examples: yesterday, weather awful, when yesterday.
Semantics. Semantics in BSL include iconic or visual signs. These are signs which visually represent the word of choice. Uh, these can be understood by hearing people without any BSL knowledge. For example, so here there is book, house, and football. You can see that she is gesturing to the shape of the actual object, and it makes it easier to understand. Arbitrary signs. These are signs which do not visually represent the word of choice, and so in order to understand them, you need to have knowledge of BSL. For example, 11, today, and always do not actually visually represent the words themselves. Morphology. So a morpheme is the smallest part of a word. In sign language, is the smallest part of a sign with meaning. So there are manual signs with one morpheme, such as airplane, red, and bedroom, so, as you can see. Um, there are three types of verbs in the BSL language: plain, agreement, directional, and spatial. So plain verbs stay in one place. They can add meaning and are repeated quickly or slowly, and usually facial expression is added. For example, like, research, and think. Agreement verbs show direction of action and where the people are, such as look at me or pay me, where they will typically gesture to themselves. Spatial verbs, they can give information about the path, speed, and location of the action, such as wash face.
So the type of language BSL is, it's a sign language used in the United Kingdom specifically. It's a non-verbal, natural, and visual form of language, and it's widely spoken in the UK deaf community, and it's the most popular sign language there. As you can see, the vowels, they're highlighted here. They're similar because they use the use of index finger from the right and touches different fingers on the left. Thank you. And here are references. Sharing.